Hello, welcome to our Friday Live interview here on the WomenHeart channels as part of our Friday interview series on 29 Days of Heart. I am Amy Friedrich Harnick. I'm the Vice President of Advocacy and Communication at WomenHeart. We are a patient-centered organization that advocates for women living with and at risk of heart disease. We provide education, support, and advocacy. We are here on this Friday as part of our 29 Days of Heart campaign. This is a campaign that brings together Heart Month and Black History Month. And the purpose of this campaign is really to uplift the voices of Black women, to empower them to tell their heart stories, to provide advice, and to offer hope to women and education to women across the country. We are very excited to have our guest with us here today, Darlene Scott. She is a WomenHeart Champion, which means that not only is she a woman living with heart disease, but she has taken the step to become a volunteer for WomenHeart to provide community education in the community where she lives. She's also a familiar face in our 29 Days of Heart campaign, and we like to put graphics on our social media with different quotes. And for Darlene, her quote has been, "Remember that you are a person. Patient is not your identity. I am a multifaceted person like I was before my diagnosis." Darlene, I've gotten to know you a little bit over the years, and I know that is so true. So before we start to talk about your heart story, please tell us a little bit about you and feel free to introduce yourself.
Sure. I am WomenHeart Champion Class of 2018. And outside of my work with WomenHeart, I'm a professor of writing and literature. And I'm also an author, mostly poetry, and a visual artist, mostly collage, and a little bit of a fitness freak. I love to run. I'm a distance runner. Not as much distance since my diagnosis, but I still run.
Well, that is a great segue into your heart story because we want to hear about that. And I know that you were in the middle of training for marathon when your diagnosis came down. So tell us a little bit about your heart story, please.
Sure. So I was at the peak of, I like to think of it as the peak of my life. This was 2016. And career-wise, I was doing really well. I had gotten a promotion. In terms of fitness, like we were talking about, I was a fitness instructor and I was training to become a certified personal trainer. And I was training for my 7th marathon, or what would have been my 7th marathon, I should say. And so yeah, I was feeling really good about life. And in the fall of that year, actually, let me go backwards. In the spring of that year, I started training for the marathon, and which was typical. Usually I would start training in the spring and then train through the summer and run a marathon in the fall. So I started my training. It started out well, but then I suddenly noticed that my conditioning wasn't improving. I wasn't getting faster. I didn't seem to be getting stronger. And so I addressed it in my annual visit with my primary care physician, told her what was going on. The other thing that I was experiencing was fatigue, but I assumed that was because of my life. Like I was talking about my lifestyle and I was doing all these things. So I thought I was just fatigued from doing all this stuff. But I told her anyway, I'm fatigued and my conditioning isn't going well. So she said, we'll order some tests. The first test was a pulmonology exam to test my lungs because she thought maybe it was exercise-induced asthma. Of course, it's not exercise-induced asthma. We did a chest x-ray to follow up, and the chest x-ray showed that my heart was enlarged. The same day that I went in after to read the results of that is the day that I was diagnosed, because the pulmonologist said, because we see this, we need to send you to a cardiology clinic. I really didn't think very much of it. I just wanted to get this fixed so that I could run my marathon the following month. But I went to the cardiology clinic, and that's when I was diagnosed. So things moved really fast from there. That was September of 2016. By November, I had an external defibrillator. By July,
tell us what you were diagnosed with.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was diagnosed with heart failure. So initially, my diagnosis was simply heart failure. And it was pretty advanced. So that is to say, for those who are not familiar with the terminology, and heart failure probably sounds really scary, as it did to me. Heart failure means that your body is not, or your heart is not pumping oxygenated blood efficiently, which is to say we need that oxygenated or that fresh blood to give us energy. That's where my fatigue was coming from. And then we also saw that same day that I did went to the cardiology clinic and got the echocardiogram, that there were some electrical problems. So our heart is a lot like a house. That is, it has a foundation or the walls. And so that's the structural part. And it has electricity that keeps the house going, your electricity on and so forth. I was also having problems with my electricity. So the rhythm, the heart rhythm, our usual heart rhythm is like a 4/4. If you know music, it's just steady, right?
Mm-hmm.
Mine was not steady. And then, of course, like I said, it wasn't pumping efficiently, which is to say that's why I was having so much fatigue, because my heart was, well, tired because I was wearing it out. Because I was still running, I was still doing everything. But in any case, before the year was up, before 2016 was up, we had not only did I have a diagnosis, the heart failure diagnosis, I had a reason for why the heart failure was happening. I had medications to help the heart failure, and I had an implant that is an ICD. And the ICD is designed to help with that electricity. If my heart gets off rhythm, it is implanted in my body so that it can essentially deliver an electric shock to put it back in rhythm. So got the ICD in June, started running again in July, and I've been running ever since. Not as far or fast, but I've been running ever since. And there are still peaks. So I said I was at the peak of my life. There are still peaks in my life. There are also still some valleys. It's not completely stable, but yeah, that's my heart story.
That's incredible. The change that you had in your life in that 1 year. And I'm sure there's so many people who are watching that are just incredulous. Like, how could someone young, healthy, taking care of yourself suddenly be in heart failure? And I know that you've written for us and you've written blogs for Women Heart, and you talk about how heart disease is anything but typical. And we talk about how it can happen, in many ways, it can happen to anyone based on a number of risk factors and things like that. And you don't always look like someone who has heart disease, right? People, so talk a little bit about what you mean by that.
Sure. My earliest experiences, I'll start with a story. My earliest experiences with going into clinic were that people were surprised, even the clinicians. And they would say, I understand you run. And I'd say, yeah, I do, and they'd say, and it was always a question. Even when it was time for testing, a lot of times they would look for someone different. So they would call my name and I would stand up to go toward the clinician or the nurse, and they would be looking around me for someone else. I think the reason for this is because a lot of our messaging doesn't speak to the variety of folks that could present with heart failure. So the traditional patient is a white male, probably middle aged or older, probably leads a fairly sedentary life, probably practices the standard American diet. So we don't always look like, or I should change that. The messaging doesn't always show the diversity of experiences with heart failure. I think the other thing is that when I say the diversity of experiences, is that it doesn't always show like that people can have heart failure, which was my experience, and still run. In my mind, when I heard heart failure, I was like, oh, this is end of life. But it is in fact not necessarily the end of life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think to build on that, it really manifests this idea of bias, you could say, of what we think about what somebody looks like. And we experience that at WomenHeart. We've been doing a lot of work around the idea of missed and delayed diagnosis, because we find so often that if someone doesn't present in exactly kind of a textbook way, like you just described, heart disease doesn't even become something that a clinician might think of. They'll look for everything else. And if women aren't aware of the signs and the symptoms and things that may be happening that could be heart disease, whether it's understanding their family history, understanding the risk factors, and just the signs and symptoms of what it feels like, they might not present with the idea that it's heart disease. And if the clinician has a bias going into it based on how the patient looks, their age, their appearance, then it takes longer than it should to get to that diagnosis. And it becomes a blind spot. And we know, of course, this type of bias is just compounded for Black women and women of color, even though Black women experience health disparities and a disparity in heart disease specifically at higher rates than other women. So you would think that would cause a clinician to think about it, but too often it doesn't. And too often we hear stories of women of color not getting the diagnosis, not getting the care that they need for a variety of factors. So kind of given that as a base, what's your advice? You volunteer for Women Heart, you talk to people all the time. What is the advice that you have for women when it comes to their heart health and thinking about how to advocate for themselves and to think about how to be heart healthy?
Sure. I think the first thing, and perhaps the most important, is to know your baseline. And so we're given these numbers, like we said, the standard patient looks like this. But if you don't know what your baseline is, then it's really hard to say that you're off base. It's really hard to say you're disordered. And I think, particularly for African American women, and again, with this idea of messaging, if you don't see yourself represented by the advocacy materials that are out there, if you don't see, like, for instance, I've never had a heart attack, but we talk about the difference between what a heart attack feels like for women and what it feels like for men. If you don't see yourself represented because all of the literature says this is what a heart attack will feel like, and it's based on what a man will feel, then you won't know what your baseline is. So when I was running, like, some of my friends would say, but you were still running. And I was like, yeah, but I knew something was wrong. And they would ask me about my pace, and they would say, but that pace doesn't sound like a pace of someone who doesn't feel well, but it wasn't my base pace. It wasn't my normal. So I think it's really important to know exactly what your normal is. Knowing what your normal is going to tell you that something's abnormal, and then you can certainly advocate for yourself. Then you can go to your clinician, go to your primary care and say, something's not right, because this is different than what I'm used to, or this is different than what my body does, or what my body typically does. So when we talk about those numbers, we always say, know your numbers. And we talk about exercise and diet and those kinds of things. But again, you know what you normally eat, and now all of a sudden it's making you feel different, then maybe something's going on. You know that you walk up and down the steps every day, and now all of a sudden you're compensating and taking the elevator because you're uncomfortable doing it. Something's different, because that's your baseline, and now suddenly your baseline is out of its typical order. So I think the rule of thumb would be to know exactly what your baseline is. I'll give an example. My blood pressure is really low. Doesn't affect me. I don't feel dizzy. It's, that this has to do with, I've always had a pretty good blood pressure. And now I take medicines that lower that blood pressure. On the other hand, if I had the same blood pressure as my twin sister, I have several sisters, but my twin, her blood pressure is completely different. If I presented with her blood pressure, which is normal, by the way, but if I presented with her blood pressure, I would know that that was a high blood pressure, because that's not my baseline. So I think it's really important that we pay attention to ourselves and know our own normal, and don't just go by, these standard numbers, because these standard numbers were never based on the diversity of experiences. That is, the standard patient, again, is a middle-aged white male. I remember when we did the training with Mayo Clinic for Women Heart, talking with Dr. Sharon Hayes, and she was talking about that research is often done on male mice, because male mice are cheaper. But but they were doing the research on male mice, and so they didn't even know what would happen with female mice, much less. And this happens then again, of course, in the human space. So know your baseline.
I think that's so important, especially for those who are listening today and who may not be experiencing any symptoms. They're fine, they're healthy, but it's great advice to take this opportunity when you're feeling that way to see your provider and get those numbers. So you have your baseline. So if anything changes in the future, you'll have that base when it comes to your cholesterol, your blood pressure, and your blood sugar.
Yes.
That's a great message. Before we wrap up, I also just want to talk a little bit about what it means for you to be part of the Women Heart community. And like I mentioned before, you're a Women Heart champion. You just alluded to the Mayo Clinic. You went to Rochester, Minnesota for 4 days to go through intense training to become a champion. You met several other women at that training who also experienced heart disease. And then since then, you've been part of this community of heart sisters. So talk a little bit about what it has meant to you to be a champion and to be part of Women Heart.
Sure. Wow. When I first encountered Women Heart, so before I ever did the training, it was because I was looking for support. So I got diagnosed, and I had support around me, of course. Family, friends were as supportive as they could be, but they also hadn't experienced what I was experiencing. And so what was really important for me was having a support system. So I found Women Heart through a Google search. I got matched with a sister who had a similar background, was an athlete, if you will, and had been diagnosed with heart failure as well. And because she was so supportive, I wanted to be able to be that person for someone else. So that's how I got involved with Women Heart. When I got to the training, I remember I remember the joy, and I didn't anticipate that part. But I was like, finally, I'm around people who understand me, and I don't have to say a word. So I think what's really important. I think humans always are seeking connection, but I think we absolutely seek, as my grandmother would say, water seeks its own level. So seeking out women and having this community of women who experience something similar to what I experienced has been really affirming. I think that's the word I would use. Has been really affirming, and I appreciate it. And I'm still in touch with many of my heart sisters on a fairly regular basis. And I don't know. That's just been it's an amazing support. It's been an amazing support system. So that's what it means to me. An amazing support system.
Great. Well, before I wrap up, is there anything else that you wanted to add or share?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, great. Well, it has been great having you. I am glad that you mentioned the one-on-one support that you received. That's through our Sister Match program, and we have an app now, so you can find it in the Google and Android and Apple stores. Just look up Sister Match Women Heart, and it is an app that allows you to put in your information and find a woman with heart disease who has gone through our training, who can be there for you if you have experienced a heart attack or a new diagnosis. I encourage everyone to go to WomenHeart's website to learn more about the 29 Days of Heart campaign. It's womenheart.org/29 Days of Heart. You can also find more interviews like this, as well as graphics and information and tips and advice across our social media platforms. So please follow Women Heart. Come back again next Friday at the same time, where we'll have our last interview of the series. And again, thank you, Darlene, for sharing your story with us and your time.